You are listening Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, narrated by Litnarrate. Welcome to Litnarrate. Sit back and enjoy classic literature brought to life through narration. Here's a question that keeps people awake at 3 in the morning. Why is it that so many hard-working, intelligent, well-educated people spend their entire lives worried about money, while a much smaller group of people, some of whom never finished high school, end up wealthy beyond anything the first group can imagine? It is not intelligence, it is not luck, it is not even effort, because plenty of poor and middle-class people work harder than anyone. The answer, as you are about to discover, is a kind of education that almost nobody receives in school, an education about how money actually behaves, who it rewards, and who it quietly drains for an entire lifetime. By the end of this program, you will understand a handful of ideas so simple a 9-year-old grasped them, yet so powerful that ignoring them keeps millions of otherwise brilliant people stuck in a cycle of paycheck-to-paycheck living. Stick with me, because in just a little while we are going to cover the single biggest mistake people make with their very first dollar of extra income, a mistake that quietly guarantees decades of financial struggle. Let us set the scene. A boy grows up in Hawaii in the 1950s with two father figures. His biological father is brilliant, has multiple advanced degrees from prestigious universities, and works his way up to a respected government position overseeing education for the entire state. His best friend's father never finished the 8th grade, and yet by the end of their lives, the educated man dies with unpaid bills, while the man with almost no formal schooling becomes one of the wealthiest men in Hawaii. This contradiction became the seed of an entire philosophy about money, one that has since sold tens of millions of copies worldwide, because it turns out this story is not really about two dads. It is about two competing operating systems for the human brain, and once you see which operating system you are running, you can never unsee it. Let us call them, as the original story does, the educated dad and the wealthy dad. The educated dad believed in a fairly standard formula. Study hard, get good grades, secure a stable job with benefits, and climb the ladder. He believed a house was the biggest asset a family could own. He believed the rich should be taxed more to help everyone else. He believed job security was the ultimate goal. The wealthy dad believed something almost opposite. He believed your house, if it is not generating income, is actually a liability dragging money out of your pocket every single month. He believed taxes punish the very people who take risks and build things. He believed the goal was never to work harder for a paycheck, but to build or acquire things that generate income whether or not you personally show up to work that day. Neither man was stupid. Neither man was lazy. They were simply playing by two entirely different rule books, and only one of those rule books actually leads to financial freedom. Now, here is where the story gets its teeth. As a 9-year-old boy, our narrator wanted to make money, mostly because he was tired of feeling poor next to his wealthier classmates. He and his best friend approached the wealthy father and asked to be taught how to get rich. The father agreed, but not in the way you would expect. He put the boys to work in one of his small grocery stores for 10 cents an hour, an insultingly small wage even by 1950 standards. After a few weeks of dusting cans and stacking shelves for next to nothing, the boys stormed in, furious, ready to quit, accusing the man of exploiting children. And this is where the real lesson began. The wealthy father explained that he had never intended to teach with lectures. He intended to let life itself do the teaching, the same way life teaches all of us, by pushing us around until we either learn something or spend our whole lives blaming everyone except ourselves. He explained that most people spend their entire working lives controlled by two emotions, fear and desire. Fear of not having enough money drives them out the door to a job every single morning. Then, the moment a paycheck lands, desire kicks in, and they spend it on things that make them feel rich for a weekend. Then the fear returns, and the cycle begins again. He called this the rat race, and he said the tragedy is that most people never even notice they are trapped in it, because everyone around them is running on the same wheel. Think about how relevant this is today. How many people do you know who get a raise or a bonus, and within weeks have already found a new bill to spend it on, a bigger car payment, a fancier apartment, a subscription service they do not really need. The paycheck goes up, but the financial stress somehow stays exactly the same or gets worse. That is not bad luck. That is the exact pattern being described here, playing out in real time in 2026. So what is the alternative? This is where we get to the single most important idea in the entire philosophy, the one idea that, if you take nothing else away from this program, will change how you look at every dollar for the rest of your life. It is the difference between an asset and a liability. Most people, if you stop them on the street and ask them to define these words, would give you a textbook answer involving balance sheets and net worth. But the wealthy father's definition was almost embarrassingly simple. An asset is anything that puts money into your pocket, whether you work or not. A liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket, whether you use it or not. By that definition, your personal home, the one you live in, is very often a liability, not an asset. Think about it honestly. Every month it demands a mortgage payment, property tax, insurance, maintenance, and utilities. Money flows out of that house every single month, regardless of whether the home is going up in value on paper. Compare that to a rental property that generates more in rent than it costs to maintain. That property puts money into your pocket every month. One is an asset. One, no matter how emotionally attached you are to it, is a liability wearing an asset's clothing. This single reframe explains why so many people who look wealthy on the outside, big house, nice cars, name brand everything, are often one missed paycheck away from disaster. Their entire financial life is built on liabilities disguised as achievements. Meanwhile, the truly wealthy, the ones with real staying power, spend their energy relentlessly acquiring assets, and they buy their luxuries only after those assets are generating enough income to pay for the luxury without touching their primary paycheck. It sounds almost boring compared to the flashy image of wealth we get from social media today, but boring, consistent asset accumulation is exactly what quietly builds generational fortunes, while flashy spending quietly builds generational debt. Now let us talk about something almost nobody wants to hear, especially anyone with a graduate degree hanging on their wall. Academic intelligence and financial intelligence are almost entirely unrelated skills. You can graduate top of your class in medicine, law, or engineering and still have no idea how money actually works, because schools were never designed to teach that. Schools were built during an industrial era to produce reliable employees who show up on time and follow instructions. That is a valuable skill, but it is a completely different skill from understanding cash flow, taxation strategy, or how to structure a business. This explains something that puzzles a lot of people. Why do we constantly hear stories of lottery winners going broke within a few years? Why do we hear about professional athletes who earn tens of millions of dollars during their careers ending up completely broke within a decade of retirement? It is not because more money would not have helped them. It is because money only magnifies whatever financial habits and financial education you already have. Give someone with poor financial habits a windfall, and you simply accelerate their journey back to zero, sometimes dramatically faster than if they had never received the money at all. Give someone with strong financial habits and financial literacy that same windfall, and it becomes the seed of lasting wealth. The money is neutral. The education behind it is not. So here is a practical modern example of this asset versus liability thinking in action. Imagine two people, both earning exactly the same salary. Person one gets a raise and immediately upgrades to a nicer car with a bigger monthly payment. That car depreciates in value every single day, and the monthly payment eats into their income for years. Person two gets the same raise and instead uses part of it to buy shares in a diversified group of dividend-paying companies, or puts a down payment on a small rental property in an up-and-coming neighborhood. 5 years later, person one has an aging car worth half of what they paid, still making payments, feeling poorer than ever despite the raise. Person two has a growing pile of assets, quietly generating income every single month, income that shows up whether they are working, sick, on vacation, or asleep. Same raise. Same starting point. Wildly different outcomes purely because of where the money was directed. Let us talk taxes for a moment, because this is another area where the gap in financial education becomes brutally clear. Most employees have taxes taken directly out of their paycheck before they ever see the money. They earn, then they are taxed, then they spend whatever is left. Business owners and investors, on the other hand, often have the ability to spend money on legitimate expenses related to growing their income, and only then get taxed on whatever remains. That is a completely different order of operations, and it is entirely legal. This is not a loophole for criminals. It is simply how the tax code has been structured for well over a century, because governments have always wanted to encourage people to build businesses and create jobs, since businesses employ people and generate far more tax revenue over time than individual wage earners ever could alone. This is why understanding basic business structures, even in a very simple way, can be so transformative. A corporation at its core is nothing mystical. It is essentially a legal agreement, paperwork filed with a government office, that creates a separate legal entity. But that simple piece of paperwork can offer real protections and real tax advantages that an individual employee simply does not have access to. This is one of the biggest, quietest secrets separating those who build lasting wealth from those who work incredibly hard their entire lives and still struggle. It is not that wealthy people are smarter or more deserving. It is that they understand and use tools that are legally available to absolutely everyone, but which almost nobody is ever taught about. Now, let us address the elephant in the room. If this is all so simple, why doesn't everyone just do it? The answer comes down to something the wealthy father emphasized again and again, an internal battle far more powerful than any spreadsheet or business plan. That battle is between fear and courage. Financial intelligence is not simply a matter of knowledge. It requires a willingness to take calculated risks, a willingness to be wrong sometimes, and a willingness to keep going after failure instead of retreating into permanent safety. Most people, when faced with a risk, freeze. They wait for certainty that will never come. They wait for the perfect moment to invest, the perfect deal, the perfect time to start a business. And while they wait, opportunities that were right in front of them quietly disappear, snapped up by people who were simply willing to act with imperfect information. This is such an important point for anyone listening today who feels paralyzed by fear of making a financial mistake. Every successful investor you have ever heard of has a long list of failed investments sitting quietly behind their successes. The difference is not that they never failed. The difference is that failure did not stop them from trying again, smarter, the next time. In fact, one of the core beliefs here is almost the opposite of what most of us were taught in school. In school, mistakes are punished, sometimes severely, training us from a young age to fear being wrong. But in the real world of building wealth, mistakes are simply tuition. They are data. They are the exact mechanism through which real learning happens. Refusing to ever risk making a mistake with your money is not safety. It is simply a slower, quieter way of guaranteeing you never build anything substantial. Let us bring this into a very modern context. Think about the explosion of information available today, courses, podcasts, online communities, all teaching people how to invest in real estate, start small businesses, trade stocks, or build passive income streams online. The opportunity to educate yourself financially has never been more accessible in human history. And yet the vast majority of people still never take advantage of it, because the barrier was never really access to information. The barrier has always been the emotional willingness to act on that information despite fear, despite uncertainty, and despite the very real possibility of an early setback. There is another wonderfully practical piece of wisdom worth unpacking here, something the wealthy father called paying yourself first. Most people, when they receive their income, pay their landlord, their credit card company, their utility company, their car loan, and whatever is left over, if anything, they consider saving or investing. This puts every single other person and institution in your life ahead of your own future. The wealthy father's approach flipped this completely. Set aside money for your own investments and savings first, before paying anyone else, even if it creates some uncomfortable pressure to figure out how to cover your other bills. That pressure, uncomfortable as it is, tends to force creative problem solving. It pushes you to find additional income, to negotiate better deals, to think harder about your spending, rather than simply drifting along paying whatever bill happens to be due that week. Now, this idea makes plenty of financial professionals nervous, and reasonably so, because nobody should intentionally miss critical payments or destroy their credit. The healthier, modern version of this idea is straightforward. Build the habit of automatically directing a portion of every paycheck into investments before that money ever has a chance to be absorbed into daily spending. When saving and investing happen automatically and first, rather than as an afterthought squeezed in if anything happens to be left over, people are shocked at how quickly their asset column can start to grow, even on a fairly modest income. Let us return to that comic book story from earlier in the book, because it beautifully illustrates a concept that applies just as powerfully today as it did decades ago. As young boys, our narrator and his friend once ran a small toothpaste tube business that got them into hot water for accidentally creating counterfeit coins, a memorably chaotic childhood adventure. But their real breakthrough came later, when they built a small comic book lending library, collecting old comics that would otherwise have been thrown away and charging neighborhood kids a small fee to read them for a few hours after school. It was not a huge, glamorous business. It was a handful of dollars a week, but it illustrated something profound. They were no longer trading their own hours directly for money. They had built something that generated income somewhat independently of their direct labor, something that kept earning even during the hours they were not physically present. That, in miniature, is the exact blueprint for everything from rental real estate to royalties to online businesses today. The goal is never simply to work harder. The goal is to build something that works for you. This brings us to one of the most quietly radical statements in the entire philosophy, the idea that the rich literally invent money. This sounds strange at first, almost like something out of a heist film, but the meaning becomes clear with a simple real-world example. Imagine a rundown, undervalued property that most people walk past without a second glance because it looks unappealing on the surface. An investor with the knowledge and confidence to see past the surface might negotiate a steep discount, secure the property with a relatively small amount of money down, arrange favorable financing terms, and then either improve or simply hold the property until the market catches up to its true value. That investor did not need to already have a fortune sitting in a bank account. They needed knowledge, creativity, and the courage to act. The wealth was, in a very real sense, created out of an opportunity that 99 other people walked straight past because they lacked the financial education to even recognize it as an opportunity. This is precisely why financial education matters so much more than simply having a large starting sum of money. Give someone with strong financial literacy a modest amount of capital and watch them multiply it steadily over years through smart, informed decisions. Give someone with poor financial literacy a much larger sum, and all too often, watch it slowly bleed away through liabilities disguised as rewards, through fear-driven inaction, or through decisions made without understanding basic cash flow. The knowledge is genuinely the more valuable asset, more valuable even than the money itself, because knowledge, unlike money, cannot be taken away from you, and it compounds every single year you continue to build on it. Let us talk about specialization for a moment, because this challenges something almost everyone has been told their entire life. We are constantly encouraged to specialize, to become the best possible expert in one narrow lane, whether that is medicine, law, a specific branch of engineering, or a single corporate department. Specialization can absolutely lead to a higher salary within a specific field. But the wealthy father took a strikingly different approach with the two boys he was mentoring. Rather than encouraging deep specialization early on, he rotated them through different parts of his business empire, having them sit in on meetings with his bankers, his accountants, his lawyers, and his property managers. His philosophy was that a well-rounded understanding of how businesses actually function, how money flows through an organization, and how different professionals interact was far more valuable in the long run than becoming a narrow specialist trapped entirely within one department, dependent entirely on one employer for that specialized skill to have any market value at all. Think about how this applies to today's rapidly shifting job market. Entire industries can be disrupted within a few short years by new technology. A person who has spent their entire career becoming deeply specialized in one narrow function without ever developing a broader understanding of business, sales, communication, or investing can suddenly find themselves highly vulnerable if that specific niche disappears or becomes automated. Meanwhile, someone who has developed a broader base of financial and business literacy, even while working a specialized job, has far more options and far more resilience when the unexpected inevitably happens. This leads us to arguably the most underrated skill in the entire philosophy, a skill that almost nobody enjoys hearing about because it sounds uncomfortably close to sales. That skill is the ability to communicate persuasively to sell an idea, a product, or a vision to another human being. It does not matter how brilliant your product is, how clever your business plan is, or how undervalued your investment opportunity is, if you cannot communicate that value clearly and persuasively to other people, whether that is customers, investors, employees, or partners, none of it matters. Many highly talented, highly skilled people remain financially stuck their entire lives, not because they lack talent, but because they never developed the confidence or the skill to sell their talent effectively to the world. Meanwhile, people with more average technical skills but excellent communication and sales ability often dramatically out-earn them, precisely because they know how to deliver a message that others actually respond to. Let us take a moment to talk about fear, specifically the fear of losing money, because this fear alone probably keeps more people poor than any external circumstance ever could. Everyone experiences this fear, including every single wealthy investor who has ever lived. The difference is not the absence of fear. The difference is how a person responds to that fear. Some people allow the fear of losing money to keep them entirely on the financial sidelines for their whole lives, parking whatever savings they have into extremely conservative, extremely low return options and calling that choice safety. In reality, that approach carries its own significant risk, the risk of inflation slowly eroding the purchasing power of money that is barely growing, and the risk of never accumulating enough to retire comfortably or to weather a genuine financial emergency. Meanwhile, other people allow that same fear to sharpen their thinking, pushing them to research more thoroughly, to understand the specific risks of an opportunity clearly, and to take calculated, informed action anyway. It is not recklessness. It is the difference between being paralyzed by fear and being informed by it. There is a wonderful, almost cheeky piece of advice in the original philosophy about handling this fear, the idea of thinking a little bit bigger and a little bit bolder about both winning and losing, rather than playing so cautiously that you can never lose but also can never meaningfully win. The suggestion is to take a bigger, more thoughtful swing, understanding clearly that any single investment might not work out, but trusting that your overall financial education and strategy will carry you through the setbacks toward the wins. This is precisely the same mindset shared by many of history's boldest entrepreneurs and investors, people who took thoughtful, calculated risks again and again, some of which failed spectacularly, and some of which built empires. Now, let's bring this conversation into a distinctly modern light, something worth sitting with for a moment. We live in an age of extraordinary access to investing tools, from fractional shares of stock that let you invest with just a few dollars, to real estate crowdfunding platforms, to countless educational resources on business formation and taxation. The barriers that once genuinely limited who could participate in wealth building have been dramatically lowered. And yet studies continue to show that a huge share of the population still lives paycheck to paycheck, with little to nothing set aside for their future. This gap is not primarily about access anymore. It is about education, mindset, and habit, exactly the themes running through this entire philosophy since it was first written decades ago. The tools have modernized dramatically, but the underlying human psychology around fear, desire, and financial ignorance has changed remarkably little. Let's revisit that concept of the rat race one more time, because it deserves a deeper look. The rat race describes a lifestyle where increasing income simply leads to increasing expenses, keeping a person perpetually working just to stay in the same place, financially speaking. A promotion leads to a bigger mortgage, a bonus leads to a nicer car, a raise leads to a more expensive lifestyle that quietly absorbs the entire increase and then some. The person feels like they are progressing, because their title and their possessions keep improving, but their actual financial freedom, their ability to stop trading hours for dollars, never improves at all. In fact, it often quietly gets worse, buried under an ever-growing pile of liabilities that require an ever-growing salary just to maintain. Breaking out of this cycle does not require earning some enormous, unrealistic salary. It requires a fundamental shift in where money is directed the moment it arrives. Every time income increases, instead of automatically increasing spending to match, a portion of that increase gets redirected toward acquiring assets, income-producing investments that begin to build a second stream of income independent from the primary job. Over years, that second stream can grow to the point where it covers basic living expenses entirely. At that moment, something remarkable happens. Working becomes optional rather than mandatory. That, in the simplest possible terms, is financial freedom. Not a specific dollar amount in a bank account, but the point at which your assets generate enough income to cover your life, regardless of whether you personally show up to a job that day. Let's talk for a moment about the emotional side of money, because this philosophy spends considerable time here, more than most financial content typically does. Money decisions are rarely purely logical. They are deeply emotional, tied to our upbringing, our sense of security, our relationships, and even our self-worth. Someone who grew up hearing constant statements like "we cannot afford," that internalizes a scarcity mindset that can quietly sabotage their financial decisions for decades, even after they are earning a perfectly comfortable income. The suggestion here is strikingly simple, but genuinely powerful. Rather than saying "I cannot afford that," which shuts the brain down and ends the thinking process entirely, ask instead, "How can I afford that?" That small shift in language forces the brain to actually search for solutions, for creative paths forward, rather than simply closing the door and moving on. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but language genuinely shapes thought, and thought genuinely shapes action. Let's also address something that trips up a lot of well-intentioned people: the difference between playing it safe and playing to win. A tremendous number of people build financial plans around avoiding loss above all else. They want a portfolio that will never go down, spending decisions that will never risk embarrassment, career choices that will never invite criticism. This produces a kind of financial life that is technically stable but rarely produces real growth. The wealthiest, most successful investors throughout history have generally approached money with a very different posture, focused not on avoiding any possible loss, but on maximizing long-term gain while managing risk intelligently. There is an enormous difference between reckless gambling, which ignores risk entirely, and calculated risk-taking, which studies the risk carefully and then acts decisively anyway. Confusing these two approaches, treating all risk as equally dangerous, keeps far too many capable, intelligent people permanently on the financial sidelines. As we head toward the end of this exploration, let's talk about legacy, because ultimately, this entire philosophy is not really about accumulating money for its own sake. It is about freedom, freedom of time, freedom of choice, and the ability to pass along genuine opportunity to the next generation, rather than simply passing along debt or financial anxiety. One of the most quietly devastating patterns described throughout this philosophy is watching hard-working, well-meaning parents work themselves to exhaustion their entire lives, only to leave their children with very little beyond unpaid bills and a set of financial habits that unintentionally set those children up to repeat the exact same struggle. Meanwhile, families who understand these principles, who teach their children early about assets, liabilities, and financial courage, tend to build wealth that genuinely compounds across generations, not simply because of the money itself, but because of the education and mindset passed down alongside it. This is really the heart of the entire message. Financial struggle is very rarely primarily about how much money someone earns. It is about financial education, emotional discipline around fear and desire, and a willingness to build assets rather than accumulate liabilities disguised as rewards. None of the ideas covered in this program require an advanced degree to understand. A person does not need to master complicated calculus or advanced economic theory to grasp the difference between something that puts money into their pocket and something that takes money out of it. The concepts genuinely are simple. The difficulty has never been the complexity of the ideas. The difficulty has always been the emotional courage required to actually apply them, especially when everyone around you is running the opposite playbook, chasing bigger paychecks and bigger liabilities rather than bigger assets. So here is the transformation we promised you at the very beginning of this program. If you take just one thing away from everything we have covered today, let it be this. Before your next paycheck arrives, before your next raise or bonus lands in your account, pause and ask yourself a single question. Is this money about to buy me an asset, something that will put more money into my pocket over time? Or is it about to buy me a liability, something that will quietly drain money out of my pocket for years to come, no matter how good it feels in the moment? That single habit of pausing and asking that question, repeated consistently over months and years, is genuinely powerful enough to shift the entire trajectory of a person's financial life. It will not make anyone rich overnight. Nothing legitimate does. But it plants exactly the kind of seed that, tended consistently, grows into real, lasting financial freedom, the kind that outlives a single paycheck, a single job, or even a single lifetime. Thank you for listening to Litnarrate. If you enjoyed this classic tale, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more timeless literature brought to life through narration. See you in the next story.